Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Harry Munt. I'm a lecturer in the history of the pre-modern Middle East at the University of York. It gives me a really great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones is Professor of Ancient History at Cardiff University and Director of the Ancient Iran Programme for the British Institute of Persian Studies. He's a specialist in the histories and cultures of Persia, the Near East and Greece. He's also appeared on the BBC, Channel 4, in the Times and other media outlets with his previous books including King and Court in Ancient Persia, Ctesias's History of Persia, The Culture of Animals in Antiquity, and Designs on the Past, How Hollywood Created the Ancient World. Today, we'll be hearing about Lloyd's latest book, Persians, The Age of the Great Kings, in which he unveils the authentic, definitive new history of the Persian Empire, the world's first superpower. So please join me in welcoming Lloyd to share with us his fascinating discoveries.
So yes, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to the York Festival Ideas for this lovely invite. It's really delightful to do this. I'm always keen to spread the word about ancient Persia. It sits very close to my heart. And it's lovely to have an audience who are engaged in this idea as well. My book, which came out in April, and it's my first trade book, has one particular agenda, and that is to try to find what I have called the Persian version that sits behind the history of ancient Iran that we are mainly familiar with from the evidence mainly written by the Greeks and also by the Jews in the Hebrew Bible as well. I'll come on to both of these sources in a little while, but I'm sure that if you've ever encountered Persia in your ancient history reading, then you will have encountered them mainly through the Greek sources, which of course are highly pejorative. So my whole ambition in this book, as has been in my research and my teaching at university over the last 20 years, has been to privilege as much as possible indigenous Persian materials, and upfront that to see if we can't begin to hear the authentic voice of ancient Iran itself. It's a big ask, but can we do it? Yes, I think we can. And I'm going to try to show you how I've gone about doing that today. What I want to do then is to put the Persians, first of all, into their world history sphere. This is a map of the Persian Empire, and you can see that its center was down in southwest Iran, the Iranian plateau, in today's province called Fars province, which takes its name from the old Persian Pars, or Parsa, which simply meant the area of the Persians. The empire, which was established by the Achaemenid dynasty between 559 and 330 BCE, extended then out from this core all the way to the west in the deserts of Libya on the Mediterranean coast, down the Nile to modern-day Ethiopia, into the highlands of Macedonia, across the whole of modern-day Turkey and Armenia, throughout Mesopotamia and Iran, and on the eastern front as far as Bactria, that is ancient Afghanistan, and the Punjab in India. To the north, it reached as far as the Aral Sea and even into southern Russia as well. So it was, at the time, the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And it was, of course, created, as all empires inevitably are, at least at first, out of military conquest, and was run through very stable forms of bureaucracy and communication. A little more on that later on. The Persians themselves, who had created this vast empire, were very aware of their place within it, the centrality of Persia itself. How do we know this? Well, we know it because we can go to ancient Persian inscriptions themselves. Texts written in the Old Persian language, in cuneiform writing, tell us a great deal about the Persian mindset. So, for instance, in a simple inscription from the palace at Persepolis, and again repeated on another inscription in Hamadan in the north of Iran, King Darius the Great says simply this: "This is the kingdom I possess, from the Scythians who are beyond Sogdiana, from there to Kush, Ethiopia, from India, thence to Sardis on the western seaboard of Turkey." In other words, what we have, we could draw up a little schematic as I've done here, and what Darius articulates there is that Persia sits at the center of the world, and his empire extends to the four corners of that world. We can see that idea articulated with a little more flourish in another of Darius's inscriptions. This one comes from his tomb at a place called Nakhchirostam near Persepolis, which again is written in Persian cuneiform. Says Darius the king, "By the favor of Ahura Mazda," and that's the supreme god of Iran, "these are the countries or peoples." Interestingly, in Persian, in Old Persian, the word for people and the word for country is the same, bhumi. "These are the bhumi which I seized. I ruled over them. They bore me tribute. What was said to them by me, that they did. My law," my data in Persian, "held them." And then he lists them. And note how he lists them, first of all, looking eastward: Media, Elam, Parthia, Arya, Bactria, Sogdiana, Chosamia, Dragiana, Achosia, Satagitia, Gandhara, India, people called the Homer drinking Scythians, and beautifully named Scythians who wear pointed hats. And then he starts again, but this time working west: Babylonia, Assyria, Arabia, Egypt, Armenia, Cappadocia, Sardis, Ionians, Scythians who are across the sea, Thracians, Petassos wearing Ionians, sun hat wearing Ionians, Libyans, Nubians, men of Makkah, Carians. Once again, you can see in this division of the empire between east and west, ipso facto, Persia sits centrally within its own imperial space. And if you notice in these two lists of east and western provinces, we also have something else going on. I'll start first of all with east again: Media, Elam, Parthia, Arya, and then west: Babylonia, Assyria, Arabia, Egypt. What Darius is saying there is that he privileges, by the order in which he lists his conquered peoples, proximity to the center of the empire. In other words, those countries that were closest to Persia itself were considered to be more, what's the word, sophisticated, cultural, important, certainly, in the Persian state of mind. The other thing to note is that the idea of the empire itself is God-given, and that the Persian great kings virtually acted under the mandate of heaven, being given this empire by the gods. Again, we can see this in an inscription of Darius the Great dating to about 590 BCE from Persepolis. Ahura Mazda is a great god. This is Ahura Mazda, the great supreme deity of the Iranian pantheon. The name means the wise lord, so he is wisdom himself. And in his wisdom, what has he done? Well, Darius says, he made Darius king and gave to King Darius the kingship of this wide earth with many lands in it. So in other words, the whole empire and the success of the military might of the empire is down to the gift of the god. And Darius has been chosen as the god's champion. No Persian great king ever thought himself a god in the way, for instance, that Egyptian pharaohs did. But Persian kings were certainly the viceroys of God. They were ruling earth in the name of Ahura Mazda. So what is this wide earth with many lands or people, bhumi, in it? Again, he names them Persia, Media, closest area to Persia, and the other lands of other tongues, of the mountains and the plains, of this side of the ocean and the far side of the ocean, and this side of the desert and the far side of the desert. Here we get this understanding, of course, of the variety of geographical locales, the very different lifestyles and situations of the empire as a whole. The other thing that comes across in the royal inscriptions, especially those of Darius, this one comes from the palace at Susa, is the idea of lineage, royal inheritance. I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, Shah in Shah, king of all nations, king of this earth, the son of Hystaspes, an Achaemenid. The Persian kings loved to give their readers of their inscriptions lists of their genealogies. So Hystaspes, we learn here, was Darius's father, and that he was part of the Achaemenid clan. The Persians had originally descended from nomadic tribesmen from Eurasia. And I think this idea of clan identity goes very, very deep in the Persian psyche. So to state that he was an Achaemenid means that probably his ancestry goes back generations to these kind of tribal leaders, or we could call them khans, for instance. And the tribal leader here was somebody called Achaemenids. King Darius says, when Ahura Mazda made me king of this earth, by the grace of Ahura Mazda, I made everything orderly. This word Achaemenid is, of course, a Greek rendering of an original Old Persian term. If we were to look at this translation in the original Persian, the word I rendered as Achaemenids is actually Achaemenid. Achaemenid. That's the Old Persian way of saying the dynastic name. I draw that to your attention because, you know, in the study of ancient Persia, names really matter. If you've ever read any Persian histories, not that there have been that many written, you no doubt will be familiar with the Latinized versions of the names of great kings: Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes. This is very much indicative of the way in which Persian history has been filtered through Western sources. And it's a great shame in a way that we don't know of our great kings by their indigenous Persian names. When I was writing the book, one of the things I had to deal with straight away and asking my editor was, you know, should I be using Persian names? And he said, well, you better not, because nobody will be able to get their tongue around them, but also because they're not familiar to us. So I had to go back and use the Latinized names. But I want to make the point here that by doing that, of course, we are denying a Persian version straight away. And it's a great shame because Persian names had significant symbolic meaning to them as well. The names of the kings that we have probably were taken by the kings once they ascended the throne. They are throne names, not personal names at all. And they're meant to convey a message. So in Old Persian, Cyrus the Great, is known as Kurush. And in Old Persian, that translates as the humiliator of the enemy, which is a really interesting way to think about Cyrus, who comes over in the Greek sources all the time as this very tolerant king. Certainly when he spoke of himself, or his own people spoke of him, it was as the humiliator of the enemy. Darius was Daravayush, holding firm the good, you know, keeping strong the empire in his hands. Xerxes was Khushayarsha, ruling over heroes. And the 5 kings we have named Artaxerxes were Artashacha, whose rule is ordained by truth. And you can see truth there is part of the word Arta. Arta is truth, whose rule is ordained by truth. Now, this idea of naming in Persian goes deeper, of course, into the bigger picture of researching Persian history. What is in a name? Well, a lot when it comes to Persian history. When we use the word Persia, which has been in circulation in Western scholarship, Western culture generally, since the time of the Greeks. Persia comes from this word Persis. The Greeks heard it as Parsa, and then translated, we get into Persia. Almost the word comes with a certain cachet of carpets, Persian kittens, beauty, sophistication, culture. And it sits really as the kind of polar opposite of the word Iran, which for so many people in the West, even today, is a byway into ideas of fundamentalism, of intolerance, of Islamic revolution, of oppression. The choice between using these two words is very personal. Some Iranians like to call themselves Persians, others see themselves as Iranians. And I can't judge on that. Throughout the book, actually, I've used the two names interspersed because there's no solution really to it. You can't say that I can use Persia for pre-Islamic Iran and Iran for Islamic Iran. It doesn't really work on those ways. And it's a hot potato still amongst Persian-speaking or Farsi-speaking peoples about what they should call themselves. But just let me pause and tell you how we actually shifted from the word Persian into the word Iranian. It happened during the early 1930s. And in fact, we have documentation from the archives of the Department of Britain's Foreign Office, in which a man called Sir Hugh Montgomery Knatchbull Huggerson writes to George Rendell, who was then the head of the Eastern Department of the Foreign Office. We have just received an absurd note from the Persian government, he says. It is asking us to speak of Iran and Iranian instead of Persia and Persians. And Rendell writes back saying, I understand the person originally responsible for this is Herodotus, who, not being able to foresee the sensitivities of the modern Persian, was insufficiently polite in his references to this country. A little tongue-in-cheek reply there, but something that was really mattering to Iranians in the early part of the 20th century, and certainly to the Shah of the short-lived Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Shah, who on the 21st of March, 1935, decided that the word Persia was no longer to be used for his country, adopting instead the word Iran. He was very well aware of the way in which the West was perceiving of Persia as a kind of Orientalist trope. Whenever the word Persia is spoken or written, he stated, it immediately recalls to foreigners the weakness of ignorance, misery, lack of independence, and so forth. And so he actually went back to a genuine Middle Persian word, Iran, which derives from the Avestan word, even older Iranian word, Aryan, which means an Aryan person, one of the people who speaks an Aryan language. And so in 1935, Iran became the official title of the country. But as I say, people within and without of Iran still oscillate between calling themselves Iranians and Persians. The difficulty we've had historically in trying to access the genuine Persian or Iranian voice of the past is because of the way in which they have been maltreated in the literature of antiquity that has had the greatest influence on us in Europe and the West. I'm speaking, of course, of the Greek sources, Herodotus, Xenophon, Aeschylus, which show the Persians in a very pejorative light as the enemies of all things freedom-loving, despots from the East, barbarians, but equally unbalanced is the very positive press that the Persians get in the book, in the Hebrew Bible, that is to say the Old Testament, where they come over as, to quote a 1066 quotation, good things. The reality of the Persian world has to sit somewhere between that, of course. But the Greeks in particular were obsessed with the foreign enemies to their east. And the Persians enter into the discourse of the Greeks regularly. Let's take a look at this one little section from Herodotus's histories then, probably from the 430s BCE. So a good 100 years after Darius had lived. Herodotus says, Darius the Great asked who the Athenians were, and after receiving his answer, he requested his bow. After taking it and loading an arrow, he shot it up towards heaven. And as it flew into the atmosphere, he exclaimed, O Zeus, may it be granted to me to take vengeance on the Athenians. When he had said these things, he commanded one of his attendants to remind him 3 times whenever a meal was set before him, Master, remember the Athenians. Now only a Greek, a pro-Athenian Greek like Herodotus, could ever have written something like that. Because in my estimation, there is no way that Darius was obsessed with the idea of the Athenians. They were, as far as the Persians were concerned, located on the far-flung peripheries of their empire, on this rocky outcrop of rock that we now call Greece. They were as far away from the minds of the great kings as you could possibly be at the time. But you see, our version of Persian history has been completely skewed over the centuries by claiming the centrality of culture was in Greece. I don't think any culture has a central point. Culture is like a gas, it moves around, it interacts all the time. But the Persians thought of themselves as occupying this central place, and the Greeks, of course, thought exactly the same. For the Greeks, the center of the world was the temple of Apollo at Delphi, for instance. And this is why, really, the narratives that we have of the Greeks, and especially of the Greco-Persian wars, is always one written from a triumphalist Greek point of view. It is true that the Greeks did manage to repel an invasion of Greece by the Persians twice, but that didn't in any way impact the fortunes of the Persian Empire. If you look at this vase painting from the National Museum in Scotland in Edinburgh, we can see the typical way in which the Greeks were thinking about the Persians as defeated, humiliating enemies. The Greeks retain their victories in the kind of zeitgeist that their art and literature, the propaganda of the day, propounded. We really see it in this incredible, squat little wine jug now in Munich. It shows a Persian who is leaning on the outside of the jug, proffering his buttocks to this Greek hoplite who is going to take him by the scruff of the neck. And you can see he's holding his erect phallus in his hand, so he's going to sodomize him. There's a little speech bubble that comes out of the Greek hoplite, and he says, I am Eurymedon. And the other Persian, the Persian who stands over, says, I am bent over. In other words, this is a play on a fortuitous moment in history when the Greeks, the Athenians, had a victory over the Persians at the Battle of Eurymedon. And here the hoplite takes on, if you like, the personification of the battle. So Ken Dover, one of the great classicists of the 20th century, said the message of this vase, which it encodes here, is very simple. It's basically, we buggered the Persians. But this idea of male rape is very much part of the zeitgeist, which has created this imbalance in our understanding of Persian supremacy in the ancient world. In the West, we won't allow them to have that place. The historiography of this goes way back to the age of enlightenment. John Gillies in 1787 said that the Persians wanted to enslave the Greeks of Asia Minor and threatened Europe with the terrors of Asiatic despotism. The kind of rhetoric that we're familiar with through the prism of Islamic terrorism, in other words, has its first outing in the idea of the terror of despotism and the suppression of European freedoms that were perceived to have come from Persia. George Curzon, who became the Viceroy of India in the 1890s, the biggest role in the East any Briton could have, really rather puzzlingly wrote, "The normal Asiatic would sooner be misgoverned by Asiatics than well governed by Europeans." It is this Orientalist concept of despotism or ill-founded nature of despotism that forced the way in which we receive the Persians in historiography, and it still goes on. One of the interesting things, I think, about the results of privileging this Greek and then latterly the Roman Empire, of course, was the effect it's had on the creation of the British Empire, of which, of course, there's a lot of debate going on at the moment. The bastion of classical education, of course, were always the privileged schools of white European males. They went into the bureaucracy of the British Empire, and really they ran the empire on the model of imperial Rome. It's not the easiest model to go with, because the Romans, let's have to face facts here, were terrible taskmasters, terrible rulers, or autocratic to say the least. Yet within those learned halls, the schools, Eton, and latterly Cambridge and Oxford, not only were the classical languages being privileged, but even the idea of being human, a rational human, was forwarded too. So the Greek classicist H.D.F. Tito, in his very popular and still best-selling 1954 book, The Greeks, had this to say: "Accept this as a reasonable statement of fact. The Greeks had a totally new conception of what human life was for, and showed for the first time what the human mind was for, thereby writing off entirely not just the Persian civilization, but the civilizations of Mesopotamia, India, Africa, Egypt as well." This privileging of the past goes deep into our historiography. John Stuart Mill in 1867 went so far as to say, even as an event in British history, the Battle of Marathon is more important than the Battle of Hastings. It's really quite remarkable. In other words, our European Western identity was dependent on the repulsion of the Persians, who would have taken over the world and enslaved us. Why it's important then to get into the heart of the Persian version is to see and understand how the Persian Empire ran very differently from the way in which the Romans, and then latterly, based on the Roman model, the British ran their empires. So for instance, in the British Empire, you had to speak English to matter. Even if you wanted to work in some bureaucratic office as a clerk, you had to speak English. Likewise, under the Romans, Latin was required of everybody in an official position. The Persians never imposed their language on conquered peoples, and instead they decided to use a common language, Aramaic, which could be spoken and written by scribes from one side of the empire to the other. There was no use of language as a tool of colonialism or conquest. Moreover, the empire was crisscrossed with roads and also with sea routes. And we know from Persian texts that individuals traversed the empire in ways that not even the British did in the 19th and early 20th centuries. We find that the way in which the Persians ran their empire was to install satraps or governors in different areas who worked with local elites and local people in the governance of these areas, not changing anything in the local systems. And we even see in Persian art, there is more of an employment of the different artistic styles of the conquered provinces, which come together to create something Persian, than the imposition of anything Persian on the conquered peoples. As you'll know, if you go to any Roman site from Hadrian's Wall to Syria, you can always identify a Roman city or a Roman temple or a Roman villa. It plonks itself on the landscape, just as we have, bungalows in Simla in India and so forth. But the Persians never did any of that. They had a laissez-faire attitude to their governance. Despite this, historians still insist in this idea of the Persians would have brought to a halt the growth of civilization in the West. The ramifications of the Greek triumph of the Persians are incalculable, says the German scholar Hermann Bengston, as recently as 2012. And Andrew Bayliss, a young scholar at Birmingham, in 2020 says that if the Persians had conquered Athens, there would have been no Thucydides, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, or Plato. None of this would have been possible. This completely contradicts the way we know that the Persians operated their governance. In fact, the Persians had encountered democracy already when they had conquered and brought into their empire the Greek-speaking cities of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. There, democracies were already up and running, and the Persians did nothing to change it. In fact, the Persians never changed the local forms of governance as long as taxation was paid and the tributes that the great king desired flowed into the treasuries in Persia. They were simply a kind of hands-off people. This was very much realized back in the 1940s by the brilliant classicist, poet, Robert Graves. And it was he actually who came up with this title, The Persian Version, which I've employed for my scholarship. In an amazing poem published in 1943, at the height of the Second World War, when Graves was thinking about issues of British propaganda, he came up with this idea that, for the Persians, their version of the Battle of Marathon would have been decidedly different from the Greek version. The Persian version then reads like this: truth-loving Persians do not dwell upon the trivial skirmish fought near Marathon. As for the Greek theatrical tradition, which represents that summer's expedition not as a mere reconnaissance in force by 3 brigades of foot and 1 of horse, their left flank covered by some obsolete light craft detached from the main Persian fleet, but as a grandiose, ill-starred attempt to conquer Greece, they treat it with contempt and only incidentally refute major Greek claims by stressing what repute the Persian monarch and the Persian nation won by this salutary demonstration. Despite a strong defense and adverse weather, all arms combined magnificently together. It's a very insightful way of articulating the discrepancy between the Western account and the Persian version of Persia's past. And in fact, when you dig into the Persian version, you can almost contradict every aspect of the Greek conception of their Eastern barbarian enemies, barbarians in inverted commas. So for instance, this little cylinder seal image here is the counter image of the Edinburgh vase image that I showed you. Here, a great king, muscular, defeats a Greek hoplite soldier who falls beneath his feet. We must look always for the Persian evidence. And it doesn't come, unfortunately, like Herodotus in one neat package. We've got to look for it. We have to work with Persian evidence like putting together a giant jigsaw. We have to use everything that is available, from epigraphy to archaeology, iconography, and cuneiform documents written in Elamite. Everything from tiny inscriptions on very high status silver tableware like this, which actually has the names and titles of Xerxes written into it, to statuary composed sometimes outside of the Persian center. This one was made in Egypt and then later moved to Susa, where it was discovered in 1972, to tiny artifacts like cylinder seals, which nevertheless encode imperial images on them and were disseminated throughout the Persian Empire. Then to huge monumental reliefs, wall carvings, which utilize both iconography and epigraphy together, and even imperial landscapes themselves, like this rock face here at Nakhchirostan near Persepolis, which was the necropolis of the Achaemenid kings, and of course their palaces. Here's the Gate of All Nations built by Xerxes, his great entrance portal into Persepolis, which at the top has trilingual inscriptions in Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite too. In fact, the epigraphic evidence that we can articulate, that we can use to find our Persian version is fulsome. Everything from clay tablets, baked brick tablets, to things like this. This is an inscription of Darius from Persepolis, written in sheet gold. And then, of course, we have the myriad of material cultural evidence available to us. A vast amount of disparate sources, from sculpture, coinage, jewelry, paintings, and even fragments of textiles as well. During the course of its history, the empire of Cyrus the Great incorporated more and more lands. Egypt, for instance, was brought in under his son Cambyses. And by the time we get to Darius I and his son Xerxes, we are dealing with the High Empire, consisting of 32 separate lands, all brought under one leadership. It's very interesting, of course, that in the iconography at Persepolis, we do not see the idea of warfare being propagated. But in the cylinder scenes, we certainly do see the depiction of great kings as warriors, here defeating Scythians or nomads from the northeast of Iran. So warfare, of course, is part of that Persian world. In fact, on coinage, we see the great king represented in two of his main guises, as a bowman or an archer, and a spearman, and also a horseman. The greatest feats of martial prowess for the Persians were to be horsemen, first and foremost. It was an equine culture. And then on horseback, they used the bow and also the spear. This was the way in which they created their empire. But in their official art, the great monumental art of the empire, warfare is conspicuously absent. Instead, what the Persian kings show is a world of harmony, where representatives of those 32 different lands or peoples of the empire come in harmony to present their gifts to the great king. They come from every part of the empire, each one of them bringing artifacts or livestock particularly associated with that area. No part of the empire is left out, and every representative of those different parts of the empire are dressed in national costume, as it were. And it does seem that the Persian artists were really fascinated by ethnic diversity, right the way down to the Nubians from Ethiopia here. What the Persians demanded of their conquered peoples were, of course, taxation, which could come in the form of silver or gold, but more importantly, in livestock and in artifacts themselves. An inscription from Susa shows how this gift-giving process worked. Darius has inscribed at Susa a recollection of how he built his palace there. And in it, I won't read the whole thing to you now, you can read it later on, pause the video if you rewatch it. He says that cedar timber was brought from Lebanon, turquoise came from Bactria, lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan, stone and stone masons were brought from Greece, that ivory was brought from Egypt. In other words, to create these monuments of empire, Darius and his successors utilized the resources of the empire, bringing people together in, at least on the surface, a harmonious work together. And this idea of the empire as being a harmonious unit is emphasized in a motif we call the Atlas pose, where the king sitting on a throne is supported by members of his empire, again dressed in their specific localized clothing. It's a motif that the great kings return to time and time again. On his tomb here at Nakhchirestan, Darius stands on this platform uplifted by these people from the empire, and an inscription running alongside says this: "If now you shall think that how many are the countries which King Darius hold, look at the sculptures of those who bear the throne, then shall you know, then shall it become known to you, the spear of a Persian man has gone forth far, then shall it become known to you, a Persian man has delivered battle far indeed from Persia. Darius the king says, this which has been done, all that by the will of Ahura Mazda I did. Ahura Mazda bore me aid until the work was done. O man, let this not seem repugnant to you. Do not leave the right path. Do not rise in rebellion." In other words, what Darius does here is to articulate the two sides, as it were, of the Persian coin. He states, of course, that his empire has been created through conquest, and we can't get away from that. The Persian Empire was founded on military force. But at least the aspiration of the empire was to think of it as a harmonious unit, working together. And in fact, in the Persian inscriptions, we find a word that you get in no other ancient source. And that word is vishpazanam, which we can translate as multicultural, a very modern concept. But this is how the Persians saw themselves, as a multicultural empire. Now, of course, if things went wrong and there were rebellions, the Persians came down on foreign peoples like a ton of bricks. But on the whole, as long as things operated smoothly, they left their conquered peoples alone to rule themselves under the auspices of a satrap, as they'd always done. What does this mean for us? Well, I think it means that we can see in action a pax persica. Persian peace was in operation for the majority of the time, not always, but for a majority of the time. It also means that if we reflect on how ancient history has been taught traditionally, with the emphasis all the time on Greece and Rome as the founding building blocks of our world history, our civilization, it's a great shame, really, that Persian history was not taught at places like Eton and Sandhurst and Oxford and Cambridge in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It wouldn't have stopped Britain creating an empire, I don't think, but it might have provided a blueprint for how an empire might have been run differently. And for millions of people across the globe, it might have meant being under an empire and yet retaining some sense of dignity. If you're interested in Persia more, not only just buy the book, but also a few forthcoming things that I'm involved in. In the British Library from October, we have a new exhibition on Alexander the Great, the making of a myth, which obviously incorporates a lot of Persian material. And then in April 2023, that should be April 2023 to August 2023, I'm sorry. There's a big exhibition at the British Museum called Power and Prestige from Cyrus to Alexander, which I'm working on as well, with plenty of really good Persian things in it. I will leave it at that now. I've probably gone on a little too long, and allow you to ask me any questions or pass on any comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lloyd, for that that wonderful tour through the different memories of the Achaemenids and their empire, and the various ways in which, as historians, we need to look beyond those and try and see what this Persian version really tells us. And we've got lots of questions coming in to the chat. I do apologise if I don't think I'll be able to get round to everybody, but I'll start moving forward. We've had so we've had a few questions about language, actually, and so one partly about the different languages that you would have to know as a modern historian to approach this history, but also about in relation to your point, I think, about the Persians not imposing their own language. We've had a question about in what way was Aramaic not an imperial language? If it was only used in various distant regions due to the empire, how was it not an imperial language just because it wasn't Persian?
It was a pragmatic solution to a matter of communication trans-empire. Aramaic was used from Ethiopia to Bactria, to Afghanistan. Every scribe was conversant, fluent in Aramaic. It meant that communications could continue regardless where you were, and that there was no language privilege attached to it. And that's the important thing, Unlike Latin or unlike English in the British Empire, there was no dominance given to that language. I sit here as a proud Welsh-speaking Welshman, who is still experiencing in my daily life, the effects of what happens when a culture loses its language, nearly loses its language. The Persians had no concept of that whatsoever. They simply did not want to go anywhere near that. And so Aramaic, we do call it Imperial Aramaic, but only in the fact that it was used throughout the imperial territories and continued with an afterlife long beyond the Persians.
Thank you very much. So another question we've had is about how the historiography of ancient Persia has developed in the last 30 years.
Very interestingly, really, nothing was being done. I mean, we were just taking the Greek accounts all the time. And it was in the early 1980s, which was interestingly just on the back, really, of Edward Said's publication Orientalism, which of course was a major seismic shift in the way that we looked at East-West relations, that a group of scholars set up a series of workshops, first of all in Groningen in the Netherlands, asking about the state of ancient Persian studies and reassessing the evidence that we use. One of the opening question they asked in the first of these meetings was the empire, the Persian Empire, in a state of decay by the time Alexander of Macedon got to it? Because that was the trajectory in which classical authors had talked about it. After Xerxes failed to capture Greece, the whole thing, slid into chaos with harem battles and eunuchs running wild around the court. Can we accept that? And of course, we began to look at, again, the Persian version of things and discovered that no, in fact, all the evidence stands for the fact that Persia was actually in a very rigorous state of health at the time of Alexander's invasion. There was no slide into depravity or degeneracy at all.
Thank you very much. Yes, so still lots more questions coming in, and also plenty of comments I'll pass on just to say thank you for a wonderful presentation as well.
Thank you.
Coming in. A question about the I think it must be referring to one of the quotations about when you were talking about the difference between Iran and Persia and the controversy there, about whether, given that one of the terms is obviously related to Aryan, whether there's anything, whether there was any, and if this was anything to do with Nazi associations of the term.
No, it's an important point to make. Thank you for bringing up the question. No, Aryan is simply a linguistic term. It relates to a group of Aryan languages from Central Eurasia, has nothing to do with race, nothing to do with ethnicity. Unfortunately, it's a term that was hijacked by the Nazis in the 1930s in their desire, of course, to create this kind of idea of an Aryan supremacy, in which they thought actually that the sophistication of Persia needed to play a part. So no, it has nothing to do with Nazi ideologies at all.
Well, thank you for clarifying that for us. Another question about, I guess, if the traditional ancient Greek view of Persia was so negative, why did Alexander the Great encourage the mixing of Greek and Persian cultures after his, a bit beyond the time of your talk? But
yeah, well, don't forget, Alexander himself was not Greek. That's an important thing to begin with. And in fact, the milieu in which Alexander was raised was highly Persianized. Macedon had been part of the Persian Empire for about 150 years, had broken away from the empire, but still was very much a kind of a friend of Persia. During Xerxes' invasion in 480, for instance, Macedon had actually sent troops to aid Xerxes in the conquest of Greece. Alexander was no lover of Greece and certainly no lover of Athens. And in fact, what he saw in Persia was no surprise to him. He took to Persian customs so readily because he understood them already. He was part of a kind of Persianate world already. So it's not a kind of shock to the system that so many Hellenic historians have wanted us to believe.
Thank you very much. Yeah, still more questions. We have 5 more minutes or so, if you don't mind me keep asking. If I mean a bit perhaps a slightly counterfactual, but I wondered what you might have to say if had the Persians left more written sources, how might this have influenced our sense of West Near East in modern times? A tricky one to answer.
Yeah, I don't think it's worth going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But just allow me to say then that the ancient Persians had a sense of history. They understood their past, but it's just that they remembered it in a different way. So the way in which the Greeks constructed history, historia, okay, the Greek word actually means an investigation. By the time we get to Thucydides, we began to get this more of a sort of forensic approach to what history is, okay, and that gives us our Western approach to it. But in fact, the Persians understood their histories. They knew their histories, but transmitted it in ways which were appropriate to them. And of course, that's predominantly through oral transmission, and especially through song and poetry. It would be negligent of us to think that the rich Persian heritage of poetry wasn't already up and running in antiquity. It's been part of the Persian psyche for centuries. It must have been there in antiquity as well. And in fact, even Herodotus says that he knows that there are multiple stories of Cyrus the Great circulating in different parts of Persia, probably, of course, with different propagandistic purposes as well. We see the results of this Persian version of the past and the way in which they tell the past in an amazing book called Shahnameh, which means the Book of Kings or the Epic of Kings, which was penned by an individual called Ferdowsi in 1000 CE, so the early Middle Ages. It is an amalgamation, a mix, a mashup really, of history, myth, and legend, which tells of the longue durée of Persia's history, in inverted commas, from its foundation by Jamshid, right the way down to the fall of the last Sasanian kings and the coming of Islam and the Arabs. It is their version of the past, and it doesn't matter to them what is history, what is legend, what is reality, what is myth. It's all part of one glorious narrative. And I think in a way, it's a very liberating way to think about what is history and how we try to filter it as well. For the Persians, in something like Shahnameh, they could write what happened, what might have happened, and what should have happened. All of that can go into a narrative with, and you can't put a pin between them, essentially.
Thank you again. We are coming to the end now, but I think we've got time for one more question. And I think I'll go with this one. What do you think is the Persians' greatest legacy?
For ancient Persia, it is this concept of multiculturalism, which we're only now getting a handle on. You know, it's such a buzzword today, but it's still quite an astonishing concept. And even if the Persians, you know, still control their empire by force, even to have thought, conceived of a world which was multicultural at that time is quite a remarkable feat of human achievement, and one that I think we have to hold on to today. I'm a big believer in trying to study global histories, and even to study as much as we possibly can global antiquities too. The age of European supremacy is over. We can no longer simply privilege Greece and Rome. We have to look elsewhere and put Greece and Rome alongside the comparative societies that it engaged with on such regular basis as well. Greece and Rome were not an island in themselves. And I think the more that we can look at history on a global context, the better it will be. I can just confirm that by saying about my own experiences as a lecturer at Cardiff University. We have a very diverse student population. You know, we have a lot of Somali students, for instance, who have families who've been in Cardiff for many generations. What does Athens offer them that a study of ancient Ethiopia can't? We have a duty to tell everybody about the richness of world heritage. And that's what I've tried to get the ball rolling in my own small way with the book, essentially.
Well, thank you so much again for answering these questions and for your fascinating talk. I'm very sorry to those of you who we just couldn't find the time to answer your questions, but thank you very much for asking them. So thank you once again, Lloyd. If you would like to purchase a copy of Lloyd's book, Persians, The Age of the Great Kings, as well as other speakers' books with signed book plates from our partner, Fox Lane Books, then please go to see the festival website or head directly to their website, foxlanebooks.co.uk/festival-of-ideas. I think they might be being put in the chat, those links. And we very much hope that you will continue to be engaged with the Festival of Ideas at York. Check out the website, yorkfestivalofideas.com, for full details of all other events in the programme. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and continue the conversation using the hashtag #YorkIdeas. And just, I'm sure you will join me remotely in thanking Lloyd once again for an excellent presentation.